Hello? Do I speak first or do you speak first?
Oh.
I'll speak first.
Yes.
Can we roll the trailer? We should have a Cultist Simulator trailer.
I can jump in if you need.
You can narrate the gameplay pixel by pixel.
Okay, so top left pixel is going to be black. Called it.
It's time to start. You're crossing the dunes of a distant sand world when suddenly you're attacked by an urchin.
So I want to take the opportunity to recommend Vanessa Williams from Seattle, who put together that trailer for us. It's really good if you ever are looking for a freelancer to do the trailer. But that's Cultist Simulator, which is a game about being the antagonist from a sort of Lovecraftian horror story, although the mythos is explicitly not Lovecraftian. And I want to start by talking about the very last thing in that trailer, which was the date we were going to launch. And we had the opposite experience from Ben, and we've also talked about whether that was a mistake or not. We set our, the trailer, the publication date, the launch date, was the same date that we gave in the Kickstarter. We said May, so launch date was 31st of May. And we kept to that all the way through production. When we took the game to exhibit at Resd in London, we had a backdrop with 31st of May printed on it, and a number of journalists and other game devs came past and said, yeah, that's rather bold, isn't it, putting your release date on the backdrop? That's an interesting decision. And we know how to do production. And we made the release date, and we didn't crunch. We worked a bit overtime the last month, because that's what happens, but we didn't work overtime for an extended period, because we're a no-crunch studio. We committed to that. And I'm glad we did it, because we wanted up front to make an experimental game with finite resources, get it out the door, and as Ben said, we were making this decision thinking about what was best for the studio, get our debut game out there and iterate on that in terms of our next project. But by committing to that decision, we placed a hard limit on the things we could put in the game. So every time we wanted to put something else in, we had to cut something. There were no two ways about it. We're a two-person team with some freelancers, so we couldn't bring in more resources, and we weren't going to extend our end date, so there were 3 or 4 things that I wanted to put in the game that we had to take out, but we just didn't have enough time. We talked about whether we want to do that next time. We're still not sure. We think probably we'll just allow a bigger time for closing, a longer time for closing the game, and stick with it, because we enjoy the chutzpah of saying, here's a release date. But it's if you make a decision, and you think it's the wrong decision, often there are people who made the opposite decision will tell you made the right decision.
What was the period you committed to?
Okay, so I'll go back and talk about the whole production schedule of the game, because it was unusual. So I made a game called Fall in London, and on the back of that I founded Failbetter Games. And at Failbetter we made a game called Sunless Sea. And after making Sunless Sea, I decided I was fed up with running a studio. I wanted to do more writing and design work and less management. So I left Failbetter and kind of walked the earth for a year, doing like Ronin freelance work with people like Bioware and Telltale and Paradox. And Cultist Simulator began literally because I left Failbetter in May 2016 and I thought I'm going to take a month off. And bollocks was I going to take a month off. I can't not make games, so I started making a prototype in that month. I put together a JavaScript prototype of the game, which you can still find on the web somewhere, that just trialed some of the mechanics, without knowing if I was going to make an actual proper game of it. And then people quite liked it, so I went away to work for Paradox for a bit, and then I came back, and I made an alpha. And I put the alpha on the web, free, on itch, just for people to download, to see if people liked it. And then I went away to work for Bioware. And then I was just about to go back and do a bit more work on the game, and Telltale contacted me, so I went away and worked for them. So I initially did like 2-3 months work on the game back in 2016, and then didn't touch it for most of a year. And then thought, okay, I'm going to make this an actual commercial project. I ran a Kickstarter. I abducted Lottie, who is the other half of Weather Factory now, my co-founder, from Failbetter, where we'd met. And she came on board. We made the rest of the game in October, November, December, 8 months. It was brisk. And I think one of the things that in the current market as an indie developer, I would unhesitatingly recommend, and there aren't many things I would unhesitatingly recommend, one of the things I would unhesitatingly recommend is to use your constraints as weapons. I'm from London, and we don't have the same kind of constraints that you do work in South Africa or, I imagine, Brazil. But still, as a 2-person team with a relatively small budget, making a game, it looks like that, right? It looks like cards, 2D art, simple animations, lots of text. Here's another game about cults that came out not long before Cultist Simulator, Far Cry 5. We can't compete with Far Cry 5, so we didn't even try. You know, we said, this is a game that looks lo-fi, it's not going to appeal to everybody. We hope you like reading, because there's a lot of words in the game, and we're not going to put in a fucking tutorial. That was an early creative decision, and one that we went back and forth on lots of times. Our publisher was very definite they wanted to do a tutorial in the game, and we said, it's a game about finding out what's going on in the game. It's a game about probing hidden mysteries. It's a game about trying to put the pieces together. If we give people a tutorial, we set the expectation that the game will be explained to them. The game has to be something you dig into. And that turned out to be the right decision. But as Lottie's pointed out, that constant creative pressure, potentially to add a bit more tutorial, potentially to make the game more explicable, also encouraged us to make the game more comprehensible at the beginning and to provide more trails into the game to make it more accessible, even though it doesn't have a tutorial. So I think that's the second thing I would unhesitatingly recommend. Maybe the only other thing I would unhesitatingly recommend to an indie dev is form a strong relationship with your community early and listen to their feedback. Because without the feedback of our community, this game would have been a catastrophe. It would have been, I think, still creatively quite interesting, and would have still achieved some of our experimental goals for it. But it wouldn't have been very much fun to play. So your limitations are weapons. You know, pick 2 things you're good at, and then focus on the other 10 things you're not good at, and make those where you can part of the project. Anyway, so Cultist Simulator's made, all told, in about 11 months. It was a deliberate experimental game around the themes we've said of yearning and apocalypse. We wanted a game that encapsulated the feeling of being in a mundane place and then digging into transmundane or sublime things. And the way it does that is you pick up a card and you put it in a slot and something happens. and you pick up another card, and you put it in another slot, and something else happens, and it spits out some cards, and you put those in other slots. So that's a really basic mechanic. It's really explicitly, specifically, unhesitatingly, unashamedly, completely the Doodle God mechanic. If you ever played Doodle God, that's where the idea for Cultist Simulator came from. But Doodle God, you don't have resources. Doodle God, you don't have a plot. I wanted to use that mechanic to do something more intentional. And here's an unfortunate side effect of a game design decision I made very early on. In Cultist Simulator, everything is timer-based. You've got these timers circling constantly. You've got usually 60 seconds. You put a card into a slot, you find a combination that works, you click start, you wait 60 seconds, something happens. But actually, you've usually got 5 or 6 timers on the board. Each of those timers takes 60 seconds. And that means something happens every 10 seconds. One of the reasons I did that was I also stole from Civilization, a game that doesn't on the surface resemble Cultist Simulator at all. But if you ever stayed up till 4 AM playing a Civilization or another 4X game, you'll know one of the reasons it's so effective is that you have a series of concentric gameplay loops where every time not concentric, parallel, sorry, where every time something finishes, you're waiting for 3 other things to finish. You've researched the technology, you're about to capture that city. Okay, you'll just capture that city. While you're capturing that city, you've got a new building in your capital, so you can decide what the building to do. So you've got these constant overlapping loops. And Cultist Simulator, in a much simpler way, does the same thing. You have something happening every 10 seconds. The game will do something unexpected, perhaps every 30 seconds. And you can see that it's coming, right? You can see the timer ticking down. What that means is the game is much more addictive than I intended. And it's also been more successful than we expected. So what this means is that, and this sounds like a joke, but it's absolutely serious. I felt we had an ethical problem about RSI, repetitive strain injury, in our players. When we built Cultist Simulator, you spent all the time dragging cards into slots. And you can't automate it, you have to keep doing it. Part of the creative intention of the game is that you feel the mundane pressure of having to keep dragging your card into the work slot over and over again if you want to earn money to live while you conduct your occult researches. And that's great, when you're on a panel at Big talking about it. When somebody's been playing your game for 19 hours without taking a break, and they're doing this, and this, and this, and this, and they send you an email saying, dude, automate it, my mouse finger stopped working, then some tens of thousands of people now have played Cultist Simulator. Some of them have played it for some dozens of hours. That's a lot of hours of doing this. And I genuinely engaged a freelancer to add some automation to it because I didn't feel that we could keep on forcing people to destroy their mouse fingers playing the game. I exaggerate slightly, but it's one of the things you never realise when you're making a game is that when you are playtesting a game, or even when you're talking to dozens of people who are playtesting your game, you forget that a game that is made to be played for 15 hours, if it's successful, may be played for thousands or hundreds of thousands, or over the course of its life, millions of hours. I made Fallen London literally in the spare bedroom in 2009, and I planned for it to run for a year. I thought, I'll do all my content planning and all my revenue projections for a year, and after that it'll be a success or failure, and I won't have to worry about it now. That was 9 years ago. I left Failbetter 2 years ago. Fallen London is still running, and as far as I know, it's still running into the future. So when you are making something, obviously it's a nice problem to have, but you do need to consider the possibility of what happens if your monster escapes from the lab and starts interacting with the population at large. Question me.
Yes. One thing that we heard about a lot about your game, it's impressive that every match is a unique experience, and every match makes sense in terms of narrative structure. So I might be wrong, but it seems to me that probably you have some reference from literature, like Italo Calvino, Jorge Luis Borges. I don't know, because it seems to me that the games sometimes dialogues, of course, with games, but so much with some literature experience, like Oulipo. I mean, the writers that search for this kind of a lot of different narrative structure.
So I think Borges, Oulipo, the Oulipo writers, and Calvino are all reference points. I wouldn't describe any of them as primary inspirations, but they were all, I guess, functional elements of our thinking. And so here is the approach I like in narrative in games, and I like it not only in my own games, but I enjoy it very much when I find it in other games, which is to exalt the apophenic. So there's a great phrase, I hope, that means, it's made Ben laugh anyway, apophenia, as you probably know, is the tendency of the human mind to identify patterns when patterns are not specifically created. So you look at two dots in a line, and you see a face, even though it looks nothing like a face. So I like games that treat narrative events as bright points of interaction in a dark space. The image I've used before is talk about fires in the desert. If you think about a desert seen from above at night with campfires, and your players are travelers that pass between the campfires, and you have created those points of experience, those bright points in the darkness. You decide what happens there, but your players decide what path they take between them. And what happens in the darkness, what happens between their ears, is the most important thing in the game. When you're writing a book, or a poem, or creating a game, when you're doing something that is fundamentally imaginative in intent, the most important thing doesn't happen in the computer, doesn't happen on the screen, it happens here. Because if you think about it, anything that happens on a screen is fundamentally apophenic. If you're looking at semblance, obviously what happens on the screen in the computer is important, but that's not a literal representation, I assume, of Play-Doh platforms and dots. It's something symbolic. So I think if you are building something that is text-centric or narrative-centric, you have the opportunity to specify less. Not to take all the points of light away, not to give players the darkness, but to give them lots of space to have their own experiences in between. And I think one of the temptations of computers, of software, of games, is to simulate more, is to specify more and more closely, is to provide more and more details, higher polygon counts, fewer spaces where you don't have experience. You can't be bored in Far Cry 5. Something happens every 45 seconds whether you want it to or not. A bear on fire will crash through the trees and explode. And as I said, as indies, we can't compete with that. So allowing people a bit of space to breathe and to create their interpretations is useful. And I think that's key to what you're talking about. People do have very different experiences playing Cultist Simulator. And a lot of the experience is the ones they've created for themselves.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.